Chapter 411. Ritual Altar. Dominic stared at the ritual altar for a few more minutes, wondering if anything was still active inside the barrier. It didn't look like it, but the blood was still so fresh that it was hard to tell. Then he began to notice something strange. The blood was still flowing from the altar, running into the ritual circles on the ground to keep them refreshed with life essence, but there was no activity within the barrier. There has to be a portal or something, a link to keep the ritual running remotely, he muttered. Amy frowned as she scanned her knowledge of blood magic. I think that it might actually be all the other summoning circles. They're still more active at all the siege sites, so they're still feeding the central ritual with their offerings. It's only the ones here that we have deactivated, and who knows what percentage of the total that was. Until someone takes out the rest of the rituals, this one will continue to operate. What I am more concerned about is the fact that we can't get through this barrier. To be able to create a barrier this large and keep it up against attack requires immense power. If we keep attacking it, whoever created it is likely to come and see what is going on, which will tell us who is behind the whole scheme. But then we're left with a mage that we can't defeat in a bad mood. She noted. She made an excellent point. If shooting the barrier with both bullets and their best spells didn't even put a ripple in it, what were they supposed to do with the person who cast it? Now that's a dilemma. We could try to work together to break it, but then we risk attracting a problem we can't solve. But if we don't do anything, then this blood ritual in our territory continues to operate, and will most likely continue to summon more monsters here. If it summons more monsters here, then the problem never really ends, and we have to continually clear them out to keep the area safe. Dominic replied with a sigh. Amy winked at him. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If this summoning ritual is self-sustaining, it means that we are never going to run out of monsters to hunt, never going to run out of loot and raw materials either. So, while the mages using them to besiege cities is a bad thing, this ritual itself isn't really an issue. We could just keep the population under control here and see how long it takes for someone to come check on the ritual. Once they do, the ones guarding it can report to us, and we will know for sure who is controlling it. That information can go to someone with more power than us, and they can take care of the source of the problem, while our adventurers and mercenaries reap all the benefits. Dominic laughed at her logic. I can't say that you're wrong. If we keep hunting the area and keep the monster population under control, they won't be able to fill a siege with what they can find here. That's the major problem, right? The abundance of monsters? They can keep summoning them wherever they are, with a portion of their magic going to this ritual to summon more. And we can use it as free loot. Alexis and the leadership group, including the princes and the generals leading the forces here, all stood silently behind the pair, who had apparently forgotten that they were even present. Why does this conversation give me the feeling that national security has taken a back seat to the chance of gaining obscene wealth? Prince George asked. Because it has. At least in their minds. They didn't forget about it entirely, though. Which is better than I expected out of them. I had thought that they would go completely feral if it was just them fighting out here. Claudius laughed. More likely, we underestimated their recovery speed, and they were just back to normal by the time that we noticed. I doubt that the two of them could have resisted the urge to just run wild with a pistol in each hand. But that's neither here nor there. They're not wrong about the opportunity that this provides. If the Adventurers Guild gets wind of the ritual and the potential for randomly appearing monsters in the area, they're going to designate this as a sacred site for their members. The amount of money that can be made, especially as the monsters are summoned and will have a chance at dropping magical weapons, thanks to the world's monster blessing, means that anyone who farms this area could set themselves up for life. Prince Fahad joked. He wouldn't mind sending some of his own people from Axbridge to remain here as well. If they could be spoon-fed monsters by this ritual, it would be nothing short of handing them a license to print money. They would have to be careful about selling the monster cores, or they would collapse the market price. But other than that, it wouldn't be a big deal. Even the groups that were here today would have to be careful how they spent their newfound wealth, or the monster cores would quickly become all but worthless. If they used most of them to boost their levels in the spell gems that they possessed, it would be the best-case scenario. That would get rid of them completely, and a small group of elite soldiers, who could later be spread among the nation's armies, was a far smaller deal than thousands of extra monster cores floating around a region. Fortunately, Westover also had a Magitech factory, and they were going to start needing them as well. That would burn through all the excess soon enough. Dominic, for his part, didn't even care about the cores, other than the fact that he could use them to pay wages. They were nice to have, and he would put some in his spellbook to increase the level some more. But the real benefit of this trip was the items that had been dropped. Chapter 412. Luggage Space Limited. Dominic could see at least 3 blueprint scrolls in his storage cube, and there might be others buried under the pile of monster cores. They just fell wherever they landed if you weren't paying attention to a specific spot for them. So, with the cube now nearly full of monster cores and drop items, organization was long forgotten. It would have been nearly impossible, anyhow, as there was no space for neat stacks, and Dominic would have to move things to his other storage ring just to make space to sort it. And they hadn't even received their shares from the big bag of looting. Either bag of loot, Dominic noted. The adventurers still had a large storage bag of monster cores as well that would be split among the members of the team, and the new group had another. Dominic just hadn't had time to contribute the latest of his gains to that one, as they had been somewhat busy at the time. He really should get one of those for himself. The storage cube that he had inherited from his parents was a marvel of Magitech engineering, but its storage area was not huge. The ring he had received from the king with his reward, and it was larger inside, and the bags that the Duskblade sect carried could store half an ogre tribe's bodies if they needed to. He was working with enough space for a few weeks' rations, and they were carrying the equivalent of a small warehouse. Alexis turned to the other royals. So, what do we do here? Should we station Signia troops here to watch the area? Nobody would question that. Claudius nodded. I will transfer some of my men and an airship to the area. With the airship, they can relay messages instantly, and there are a few techno-wizards on board to load the cannons. The weather might have kept us from properly deploying them this time, but the Magitech cannons should keep most of the monsters suppressed until the ground forces can get in position. Alexis nodded. That should work. And they can keep an eye on the place from a distance. This ritual area has me concerned that it might be more than just summoning, but nobody we know has enough knowledge of blood magic to tell us for sure. When the airships arrive, have them take pictures from above, and we can have the prisoners or someone in the capital tell us more about the formation. Prince Fahad shrugged. It will have to be one of yours or a prisoner. The Axebridge mages aren't too knowledgeable on blood magic. If they were, then we could have just had the Duskblade sect identify this. But I can see them examining it, and it's clear that they're just making an educated guess at best. None of them know how to replicate this sort of magic. Alexis shook her head at the mages huddled together, passionately debating the possible uses of each of the ritual circles within the protected area. But while they were doing that, Dominic and Amy had another mission. They were circling the barrier, running their hands over the surface and looking for a flaw, imperfection, or hidden way inside. If they could find that, they might be able to shut it all down. However, when they made it back to their starting point, there was still no sign of a flaw in the barrier, or even any trace of living creatures having been there before them. There might have been some inside recently. That was impossible to tell with the barrier sealed. But nothing had stood within 10 meters of the barrier since the rains had ended. That meant that if it was a summoning ritual, the monsters weren't appearing within the barrier, but somewhere else in the vicinity. That answered the most basic question of where they were going to find the monsters. But it left one very important question unanswered. Just how many more summoning and sacrifice rituals were happening to keep this one fed? It couldn't be just 1 or 2. There was far too much blood flowing from the altar for it to be a single sacrifice, and they hadn't seen any signs that most of the rituals had a supply of captives. Of course, Alexis didn't know that Dominic had freed a whole group of hostages who were held for that purpose, but even if she did, there had to be more rituals hidden somewhere to account for this amount of flowing blood. Unless the blood was not actually from sacrifices, and the altar itself was a magical item that produced the blood for the rituals. Unfortunately, there was no way to verify that unless they could get inside. There was so much that they didn't know, and it was driving her insane as she waited for everyone to finish their assessment so that they could assign a scouting team to watch the area while everyone else went home. You look vaguely disappointed. Prince Fahad joked as Dominic made his way back over to the group. Today was going so well. The rain stopped, there were monsters and loot, and I got a new crafting recipe. It's just a shame that it has to come to an end like this, you know? Not only are we out of monsters, we're stuck with an anticlimactic half-answer and no Dagos princes to kill. Dominic replied with a wink and a dramatic sigh. Well, you can't win them all. But I think that the testimony of the mages we have captured should go a long way to solving the mystery of who exactly has been behind all of this. None of them know all the details. But they all know different details, and I have heard that the Duskblade sect is already starting to piece them all together. Fahad replied, well, that is good news. But who won the competition to the center? I kind of lost count as we were fighting. Alexis laughed and took out a level 27 monster core. We found an ogre lord on the way in. Looks like you've lost this round. Chapter 413. Not designed for this. Back in Westover, the situation was changing rapidly. The mages had brought back dozens of former captives, as well as a handful of captive mages, all of whom needed to be placed somewhere, and in some cases, they also needed protective custody, which was beyond what the jail could offer. It was never designed for holding mages. So, the Duskblade sect was overwhelmed with new arrivals, all of whom needed special treatment, and they didn't have enough healers to deal with all of the injuries. That meant that when the paladins returned to town, they were swamped with requests for assistance, and the Signia Royals were left with only a few men each, while the rest were sent to help with the wounded. Then, the soldiers started to return, with even more wounded. Dominic could already see that this was going to be a long night for everyone, even those who had no particular healing or comfort-related skills. The tailors, the techno-wizards, the carriage makers, pops. Every shop in town was flooded with repair orders and requests for new items that the soldiers hadn't been able to afford before today. The adventurers were silently celebrating the fact that they had been the first to return, as their orders would be the first ones filled. But there was no way that the craftsmen in town could possibly fill all the requests that they were getting. The start of the economic issues from adding thousands of higher-level monster cores to the economy had started, and Dominic could only imagine what was going to happen when a merchant caravan came along to buy up the unwanted magical items. They would not be at all prepared for the level of offers they were going to receive. However, this was nothing new to the Adventurers Guild. Monster hunting was hit or miss, so they often had a huge stock of items held on consignment, waiting for someone to purchase them. It was the only way that they could keep a sufficient stock without getting into the weapons reselling business. The guild wasn't interested in that, but they would happily hold onto weapons for sale so that adventurers could sell to each other and have the money applied to their guild account to be picked up wherever they were. Many would place weapons for consignment in the big cities, then move along to the next mission, and eagerly await someone's purchase of their gear for a much better price than they would get from a wholesale weapons reseller. Lord Dominic, we have your share of the monster cores from the trip. Would you like them now? The guild master asked as Dominic returned to the manor. I didn't expect to see you so soon, but sure, I'll take my share now if you've got it with you. What brings you by? Dominic replied, startled to see the dwarf outside of his office. Just the usual minor issues. I wanted a direct answer on what is happening with the monster population. Are there going to be more? Should we request another batch of adventurers? Are we expecting ongoing profits? He replied. Dominic smiled. There is a chance that we will see an ongoing monster spawn in the area. There is a ritual at the core of the army that we couldn't eliminate. However, we don't know what it does, so it might not be summoning monsters. We left a scout team, and they've got an airship nearby to relay messages, so just keep your radio on, and you'll get real-time updates. As for calling more adventurers, that might be a good idea even if the current issue is resolved. There have always been a lot of monsters in this region, and that probably hasn't changed at all, even with Dagos trying to herd them into one spot for their missions. The guild master nodded. I see. Well, I will hold off for a few days until we have solid information from the scouts so that I don't call too few or too many here for the missions that we're going to have. My guild members might take on small missions like helping the woodcutters when they're short on work, but it would be hard on my reputation if I actually called them here for that level of employment. I understand. How are the others doing? I know that there were some serious injuries when they returned. Dominic asked. All patched up. We've also got a team of clerics from Signia City coming to set up in the guild house. Westover might not be the most religious of towns, but they're an asset to have around, and the guild always needs the healers. They are also members, so they'll be going out on missions with the others if the situation calls for it. That was a direct request from Miss Bella when she returned. That woman is a difficult one to argue with, let me tell you. Dominic laughed at the dwarf's annoyance. I know, I've met her before. In fact, the mana revolver that she was carrying when she arrived in town was one that I made. The new ones are as well, but I'm sure you already guessed that. That reminded him, there was a lot of outstanding debt for the weapons that had been purchased on credit for the mission, and Bella still had a pair of rare grade mana revolvers with her on loan. He should collect them, or go get payment soon. Other than that, we have had requests from many in town for trade skill cores, and I wanted to make sure that you didn't have a problem with the commoners and farm workers getting them. Many lords restrict what skill cores go out on their territory, and who can get them. But you don't have any work camp farmers or indentured workers, do you? Dominic shook his head, then amended his answer. Well, I have a few indentured workers in town, but none of them are farmers, and I don't restrict their trade skill options. The carpenter's family still owes a little, but they'll have it paid soon. And a few of the maids are on debt contracts. They wanted money for family before they left home, you see. Those will also be paid off soon. The wages here in Westover are pretty good. That made the old dwarf laugh. Indeed. With so much going on, and most of them working for the royal family, I can see how a debt contract would be a small matter. Chapter 414. Patching Dents. By the end of the next day, things had begun to settle down a little, with the army's wounded mostly treated. There were casualties from the mission, but not so many that it would raise concerns outside of the immediate chain of command. Most of the units had come across swarms of goblins, and that had allowed them to move the wounded to the back and not take fatalities. Only the units who had encountered larger groups of strong monsters, like the units on the eastern flank who had encountered the Yeti clans, had really suffered. Dominic had taken the opportunity to spend the evening in the manor's new forge with Alexis, a questionably romantic evening of weapon repair and armor polishing spent mostly in silence. Still, it was a good break and nobody bothered them as they worked to get their equipment back into top shape. For Dominic, that meant a lot of work, as his chest plate had been completely mangled, but most of the damage to Alexis' gear was to her shield and the left pauldron above it. The group tactics of the paladins started out with much more ranged firepower now than they used to, as everyone had firearms and artillery weapons. But that also allowed them to push harder, so even with the mortar launchers and pistols, they were still frequently in close combat with the monsters, where Dominic and his team had retreated to keep the monsters at a distance. He couldn't say that their method was wrong. It certainly got the job done, but he could say that it was definitely harder on gear than a ranged attack. The only real downside to ranged combat was the immense mana usage. They had to burn through a lot of ammunition for the mortars, and that needed to be replaced between every engagement. For that reason alone, it was a better tactic in a larger group, like when they had the cavalry with them for support. What did you do to that armor? Get in a fist fight with a troll? Alexis asked as Dominic started to hammer his armor back into shape. Not quite. Though I'm not sure that the Yeti clan chief was any weaker. We met up with a group of Frostwolf riders, and they really did a number on us. We didn't lose anyone, but it was a close thing there for a few moments. Dominic explained. Well, that certainly wins the award for most unusual monster of the day, but it also explains why you were wearing just mage robes when I met you. Dominic laughed. I had chain mail underneath. But yeah, I should make myself a spare piece of chest armor. I mean, a good one. I have another, but it's one of my earlier pieces, and enchantment wouldn't stand up to even a casual strike from some of the things that we faced on that trip. Alexis winked at him. Strange how that happens when the hard monsters go from being someone else's problem to your problem, isn't it? Not long ago, you would team up with city guards to fight a single ogre. Now you just take a small group of adventurers to attack a whole camp of them. Dominic sighed. I wish that you were wrong. This power creep might pay well. The danger levels are getting ridiculous. That Yeti tossed me around like a rag doll. If I didn't have the ability to heal with Arcane Blast, I would have ended up as mush. That skill is incredibly overpowered. But I heard from the others that your arcane blast is increasing in power as well. Alexis questioned as she polished a vambrace. Dominic nodded. It seems to be linked to my base magical level, which has gone from level 1 to level 3. It's far from being my most powerful spell at this point, but the mana recovery is just so valuable that I find myself using it all the time. I can cast other spells with external mana as well, but it's slower for some reason. Like, I can cast Arcane Blast instantly, but a fireball takes a few seconds if I'm not using internal mana. It's a bit of a pain, so I rely on the mana regeneration. I'm going to make pistols with the effect later, just so I can keep up the firepower without switching spells. Amy had it even worse than I did, and after a few rounds, she was down to 1 fireball per reload, even with a mana regeneration pistol. 2 per reload would be far more reliable, but beyond that I'm not sure that constant magical firepower is something that is going to be within my abilities with Magi tech weapons. We all have our limits, but with some practice, I'm sure that you can expand your range of bonuses to the point that your creations will feel like an entirely different person made them. I mean, just look at what Pops can do compared to what you or Mead can do. You're all smiths, but he's got like a century more experience, and he can do things with metal that feel like they should be impossible. Alexis agreed. Dominic smiled. I can't argue with that. Even when he's holding back so that people don't bother him to do what might actually be impossible, it's still impressive. The talents of a true mastersmith are so far beyond what I can manage that it doesn't even feel like we're working on the same craft. Now that part is out of the way, fix this pauldron for me. That's more than I can buff out. She laughed, holding up the heavily dented piece. And you said that I'm hard on equipment. Give me your shield as well. I will patch it up and then rework the surface. It's taken way worse of a beating than your shoulder did. Is this all from the ogres? Dominic asked. Mostly. Not many other things could get past my guard. But the ogres tend to hit everything at once, and even with my strength buffed, I can't stand up to a direct blow. I need to deflect it. Chapter 415. Blueprint examined. After half an hour of mending, Dominic looked at the chest plate with resignation. It was beyond saving, and the repeated working was making the metal brittle. The best option would be to smelt it down and start over with a new piece using the same raw materials. However, he now had some better raw materials than he had used the first time. Partially because he could make them, but mostly because he now had magical items that could be smelted down from the monster horde. The items themselves and the magical bonuses on them were not great. But even the common grade magical items dropped by more powerful monsters were normally made with better materials than simple iron or copper. If he picked the ones that had the worst bonuses first, he could smelt them without anyone ever missing out on the opportunity to use them. But they were his loot to begin with, and they really weren't worth selling when he could make them into something so much better. The first item on the list was a Minotaur cleaver. It was made of dark iron, a magical metal that was incredibly durable and heat-resistant. Not particularly valuable, as far as magical materials went, but as the weapon was sized for a Minotaur to use two-handed, it would provide over 10 kilos of raw metal. Raw metal that would hold much better enchantments than what Dominic had been working with. Now, the real limitation would be the Magitech circuitry that he was able to design for it. And that was where he needed a bit of luck. He had 3 new crafting recipes that he hadn't checked yet, and there was some hope that one of them would be usable. Even if it just had a bit of circuitry that gave a bonus he wanted, it would be enough to allow him to upgrade his next works. After crossing his fingers for luck, Dominic unrolled the first blueprint, then turned it over, wondering if he'd opened it upside down. "What did you get?" Amy asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Give me a moment because I have no idea what this thing is supposed to be. The system calls it a bypass turbine. Maybe it's for airship propulsion?" Dominic replied. The pair of them examined it for a moment, then decided they needed an expert opinion. "Let's go ask Pops." The rest of the blueprints could be inspected once they got to the smithy, where the old man could give them better advice about the loot. But until they understood what this thing was supposed to be for, there was no point in opening more. The dwarf was waiting for them as they approached, as Mead had been working the front counter for the morning sales. He had pints of ale ready for the visit, and a knowing smirk that said he was expecting them to have run into something that needed his expertise. Good to see you again. I do hope that you're not being overworked. But I really can't decipher the purpose of this blueprint. I get how to make it, but I have no idea what it's for. Dominic explained, then opened it on the counter. Pops inspected it for a moment, then began to laugh. It's a steam plant turbine. If you're using compressed air or need regulated constant steam pressure, you use one of these so that you don't waste all that precious steam. Once it's up to pressure, your main drive will work as usual, and then this will run the excess steam over a secondary turbine, driving a shaft to power more equipment. You can use it for electrical power, running an air compressor, even operating a water pump. However, there are other uses. Instead of using it as a secondary option, you can use it as the primary for a power plant, and it's more efficient than the standard pumps. Pops explained. Well, there goes our theory that it was for airship propulsion. Dominic sighed. Pops stared at the design for a moment. No, you have a point. If you used it that way with Magitech Fire, you could use it to replace the propellers on an airship. I'm not sure what the advantage would be, though. The existing design is so much easier to make, and an airship can only move so fast without damaging the envelope. However, if you wanted to make a more efficient truck, you could use the steam turbine with variable vanes like these to control speed instead of bleeding pressure. The sound tends to bother small animals, though. Dominic frowned. The sound. Oh yes. A high-speed turbine makes a whistle that can't be mistaken for anything else. Is that the only blueprint that you got on this trip? I had thought that there might be one or two more coming up on the market, even if none of the others had trade cores. So, I'm assuming they traded them to you. Pops asked. Dominic shook his head. It's not the only one I got. But I didn't trade for any. The soldiers and the adventurers might have a few more that they just haven't mentioned yet. Meade laughed. Likely holding out for a few months until the glut of items fades, and they can get a better price. The only ones they'll likely sell will be the really obvious ones. That would be valuable anytime. Dominic nodded. Well, we might as well open the others. I haven't even checked them yet, so we're all learning at the same time. Then he took out another and unrolled it over the steam turbine blueprint. This one was much more practical in a military sense. There is something with you and Gunn's words. Isn't this the second one that you've received? Pops asked. It is. But this isn't a Gunn's word, is it? It's on a halberd. Honestly, this one looks like a lot of fun to use in combat. Dominic laughed. Just give the poor sap a bayonet and call it a day. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. What else do you have? Dominic shrugged and unrolled the final blueprint. Barrier shield, rare grade. For sockets. It looks like the shield has built-in circuitry for the area barrier spell, with minor mana collection to a mage-made mana gem, and some circuitry for durability. Not bad. Those 4 sockets will make all the difference when you're building them. If you socket 2 of them with Magitech orbs in advance, you can build them into the design and leave 2 more open for the user to choose. Every warrior needs more spots for skill gems, and the royal guards all carry shields. Pops narrated as he inspected the plan. Then I suppose that I should start working on obtaining new Magitech orb plans. Dominic sighed. Chapter 416. Pops can identify it. That you should. Talk to the techno-wizard. He'll get you set up with what you need. You can make munitions creation orbs and modify them yourself. It can't be that hard for you to learn to make other spell effects. Flaming Blade, or some sort of offensive bonus, would be best, as the shield already has a barrier spell built in that will activate at the level of the shield. Pops noted. Meade tapped the blueprint. You know, if you're building them right in, you can make all the effects apply at the shield's level. That means you definitely want an attack ability, because only the Royal Guards will have a skill that's even close to the level of their gear. Dominic smiled. You make a great point. Shields and spears are great for the local guards, but they're not exactly known for their immense wealth or high-level secondary skills. Letting them focus on physical enhancement Magitech orbs would save them a lot of suffering. The town guard didn't get really high-level gear, but even if he made them all a bunch of rare-grade shields at level 6 to 10 with a barrier and attack spell, they could be called elite troops in combat. With rifles to get them started from a distance, then spears and shields for closer range work, and swords when the monsters were too close for spears. They would be well-rounded. The shields would also let them use any weapon they liked with nearly equal damage output. It might not be the great advancement that he was hoping for, but Dominic was certain that he could make something of that turbine plan if he was given a bit of time. The design was supposed to be more efficient than a steam piston, so it should be adaptable to make a better drive unit for the steam trucks. Or he could use it to charge electrical lines to power lights around town instead of using Magitech light bulbs. But that seemed like a step backward in technology. Running wires all over town, which could be broken, would get in the way of construction, and which were charged with electricity, posing a contact hazard for vehicles, and anything else on the street, just seemed like a terrible idea compared to having Magitech devices in all the houses. Of course, it would also be used in the new factories to drive machinery, but that was just too basic. Pops chuckled as Dominic was lost in thought. Well, have you decided what to work on first? Dominic smiled back at him. Magitech orbs for the shields. Then I'll make a whole load of them and some dark iron pistols. I've got a bunch of common and uncommon grade Minotaur cleavers, all made of dark iron, which has to be better than what I was using. Pops nodded. How about you send a few of those my way? Common grade is fine. I just need the metal. It will help teach me the basics of working with advanced metals, and we can make some higher quality tools. Dominic set 2 cleavers down on the counter and picked up his blueprints. I'm glad you could sort that out for me. Now I've got plans for the next factory's power plant and a project to work on during my free time. The shields won't be too bad once I get a mold made for the basic shape. So I'll do them first and get them handed out to as many locals as I can. Well, locals and the Royal Guards. A little gift for the visitors never goes wrong. Pops stroked his beard as he contemplated Dominic's response. That should work. Make the Royal Guards the best ones that you can, within reason. Level 20 at least, so that the skills will hold up against ogres. They're the most common of the strong monsters, so the Royal Guard will be sent against them more than anything else. Building their equipment to specifically target what they're going to fight will make it seem even more effective than it really is. Like the rifles. They're amazing against ogres, but against hundreds of goblins, they're not as impressive. The shots are overkill. He decided. Sounds like a plan to me. They'll also be able to enhance their shield wall formation with this new gear. They already have the tactics for it, but not all of them have as powerful of a defensive barrier. Amy smiled. You know, the sect has plenty of knowledge about Magitech orbs. Why don't we head over to the tower next, and we can work on a plan to upgrade that shield. 2 built-in bonuses and 2 spell gem sockets should be more than enough for the average user. You could probably get away with filling all the sockets for the guards, but they don't have the mana to effectively use more than 1 or 2 spells anyhow. You're not wrong about that. We picked them to be compatible with Magitech and to have some magical aptitude. But they're not trained mages, and I don't know how much mana reserve training is part of their daily schedule. Likely little to none. It's not something that they need to do their jobs. At least, not during regular situations. Dominic agreed. The walk to the new mage tower wasn't a long one, but they reached the triage area long before the tower itself. There were still soldiers receiving treatment, both from the Royal Guards and the alchemists who were working alongside the army medics. Minor wounds received traditional treatment, stitches and bandages, while more serious injuries and infections got magical treatment. It was the most effective way of keeping everyone healthy when they weren't under a time constraint. Fortunately for Dominic, the ones they needed were not part of the medical team. The Magitech specialists could do many things, but healing was not among their specialties. Amy led them right into the tower, and then up a winding staircase until they reached a room that smelled faintly of burnt metal and burnt hair. That wasn't exactly encouraging, though the burnt metal might have been from a welding torch. Burnt hair was never the sign of a good day, though. Chapter 417. Need Orbs. Elder, I have brought Duke Dominic to study with you today. He is looking for Magitech orbs that can be integrated into a shield to give permanent bonuses to an item suitable for the Royal Guard. Amy greeted someone that Dominic couldn't see from his position. A moment later, an elderly mage got up from the ground, then righted a damaged chair, which promptly fell over again, with a broken leg. Right, visitors? Duke Dominic, you said? Welcome, Your Grace. You have come to the right spot. I am the foremost expert in esoteric magitech orbs within the Duskblade sect. The elder replied. His eyes narrowed when Dominic didn't respond immediately. Don't take one small failure as a sign of incompetence. I have been trying to create a magitech orb that will replicate the effect of the summoning ritual. Dominic couldn't help but be impressed. How is that working out? Even in a large orb, it would be incredibly impressive to replicate the effect of a blood ritual. The mage shook his head. Not the blood ritual version, the modified version of the elemental guardian spell. I'm almost there. Amy looked around at the destroyed lab, and the elder shrugged. I got an angry fire elemental last time. As it turns out, the runes for monster summoning and the runes for free will are entirely too similar. A minor setback. So, you were just contemplating your next adjustment. That is good news. I had feared you might be injured. Dominic added. The old mage snorted with laughter, and then waved his hand to repair his chair, which he sat upright again. Something like that. But no, I'm not seriously injured. The orb was level 0, so the elemental was not a strong one. You know, that might be a good addition for the Royal Guard if they only had enough mana. Oh? How much more would they need? Dominic replied. About 50 times what they have now. That should be enough to summon an elemental guardian for the day. Normally, you put a mana gem in the orb, so it can be recharged in advance for emergency use. But I think that we can come up with something functional for your needs. What does the item have now? It's got a circuit 4, area barrier, and 4 sockets. What do you think? The mage hummed happily as he rummaged through the items in the room and began placing partially assembled magitech orbs on the workbench. Yes, that. And that one and this one. That is good. Enhancement. That too. Yes. The rambling made Amy laugh, and within minutes, the old man had dozens of damaged or incomplete orbs on the table. Trust the process. She whispered. Once he had everything that he thought he needed, the elder began to disassemble his test pieces. What I am thinking is that we should make a linked orb that will take 2 sockets and a bit of extra circuitry. One of them will obviously be an attack spell. Something cool, like Corruption or Flaming Blade, would be perfect. Then the second half will be mana storage and effect amplification. So, they can overcharge their shield for a few minutes, burning through stored mana to increase the level and fortify the area barrier. If there is one thing that paladins love, it's the chance to do stupid and heroic things. So, giving them the chance to overcharge their attacks and barriers for some heroic last-stand scenario is undoubtedly what they secretly want. Amy burst into laughter at the effort Dominic was putting into not laughing at the man's assessment of the royal paladins. I can't say that you're wrong, but it is also practical. That extra bit could be the difference between the line holding and breaking when the guards are forming a spear wall. Dominic agreed. Exactly. Heroic and stupid. Just hit them with an earthquake if they're charging. No need for spears and such nonsense. Dominic laughed at the mage's logic. Magic was the answer to everything in his mind, and if magic wasn't the answer, you weren't using enough magic. It was somewhat similar to the brute force logic that the military applied to every mission. Perhaps some things were universal, and it was only perspective that changed. Instead of calling him out, Dominic just shrugged. When you don't have the mana to keep up a sustained magical battle, pointy sticks are a valid alternative. That's what we're going for here. Strangely, that seemed to be exactly what the mage needed to hear, and he immediately began jotting down notes on a random piece of paper taken from the corner of his desk. The page wasn't even blank, it was already partially covered with notations, but the old man didn't care. Alright, I know what we need to do. Lower mana cost for the commoners is the goal, right? Then I know just the orbs that we need. One is not a magitech orb at all, not in the conventional sense. It just collects and stores mana. Well, it does use circuitry, so it's magitech without an expressed external effect? Never mind the distinction. The second is the orb of spell amplification. That can be partially built into the shield, but some of it will need to be in an orb, as there is a focusing gem involved. The last will be flaming weapon so that the user has an offensive spell at all times. However, when we install and link them, It will activate through the amplification orb so that the mana regeneration effect will partially or fully feed the spell. If they're only focused on defense, most of it will go to the area barrier, or they can split it or even focus completely on offense. Doing one or the other will only take a fraction of the mana of using the actual ability. See? Then, they can overcharge to be the hero and still fight the long fight without running out of mana. That only leaves one socket. Amy noted.
Shaw.
One socket is one more than they had without the shield. You can't let them get greedy. Besides, it already has all the spells they've got the mana to use, so what do they need to put in it anyhow? I would be tempted to give up the final socket space to increase the mana cost reduction, but that would require a full rework of the circuitry and reshaping the shield, and that's a whole new blueprint. Nobody has time for that. Chapter 418. To Link. Dominic laughed as he put the existing blueprint on the table for the Elder to examine. Yes, I see now. We can work with this. Give me a few hours, and I will design the rest of the circuitry and the orbs. You'll need the blueprints, since they'll all be added as you build the shield. But can you make it? It's a rather complex bit of magic, and if you get any of the steps wrong, or they don't work in the order that I expect, it might not work at all. He asked. Dominic shrugged. I have a pretty good grasp of the fundamentals. It's a dragonkin thing. Wonderful. If you can replicate it on your own, we won't need to spend hours and hours trying to teach those children with no talent for true art how to make a new design. Amy sighed. You know, this is why you're always alone in your lab, right? Even when we were in the desert, you were insufferable to talk to. Has she always been this sharp-tongued? I seem to recall that she used to be so sweet. The old man complained, then began to ramble. When we first found her, she was so small, couldn't even cast a firebolt. She used to cuddle up with the cook all the time. He would carry her in a pouch on his back while he worked. Absolutely adorable.
Now,
she stands here and insults me, he announced dramatically. Perhaps it's a teenage rebellious phase? Dominic suggested. At her age? No, she's been through that already. She's just lost all respect for her seniors. The power is going to her head, and she doesn't keep old men like me in her eyes. Amy smiled and shook her head. Please know that I only tell you this because I love you and want you to be happy. You really should stop calling the others artless children for not appreciating Magitech the way that you do. The old man rolled his eyes and muttered something about irreverent brats before continuing with his design work. Dominic simply watched in silence as the process grew by the layer. The completed pair of Magitech orbs were going to take entire days to create, though the additional layers of circuitry on the shield itself, to add their effect to the innate bonuses of the design, weren't too bad. Does the language matter? I see that you used runes from the old dragon language, but that's not the same one that most of Signia's techno-wizards use. Dominic asked as the design upgrades were completed. I'm just better with this one. For Magitech orbs, it matters more that you have the perfect execution order and intent behind the magic when you first activate them. So, the runic language that you know best is the one that should be used for that portion of the construction. A small error in translation can cause unexpected outcomes. But the materials also matter. The orbs can be copper, it's a great magical conductor. But the gemstone is a non-negotiable. For one of them, it's just a mana gem. Make it as large as you like, but I find that a marble size is best for practical reasons. The other should be a perfectly clear synthetic sapphire. Not a natural stone. A mage created one without any inclusions. That won't be easy to make for most mages, but Miss Amy should be able to do it. Dominic nodded. He could do it too, now that he had the spell gems safely recorded in his spell book. But knowing that the gem requirement was that specific, not just in cut, but in origin of the stone, was a revelation. The layering is important as well, but that should be self-explanatory. There really isn't any way to do it, but from the inner layer out. Just be absolutely certain that you have lined up the connecting circuit's marks, or the orb won't activate. There was something else. Oh, right. Don't use a monster core in place of the mana gem. It's tempting, but if the user of the Magitech orb isn't 100% human, they could turn feral from drawing monster core tainted mana like that. It's not as bad as actually eating it, but still don't do it. Oh, That was information that I did not know. I thought that the only danger was from eating the cores. Dominic replied, intensely interested in this particular topic. He had lost so many months of memories over the years, and this could be related if it caused a slightly feral state in some non-humans. It was considered safe enough for humans, though intensely wasteful, as it would only cast a few spells, whereas pouring the mana into a spell gem would cause a permanent enhancement. The mage waved his hand dismissively. It's not fully studied, but it makes the trolls so dizzy that they nearly fall over, and it takes a lot to get past the immune system and healing of a troll. That's not really my area of expertise. I am certain that there was someone in the sect who studied it, though.
So, a dead end.
Dominic made a mental note to look into that later, and belatedly realized that he should be making physical notes, with how often he forgot about these things. Should we practice making this set of Magitech orbs before I start on anything else? I can make the shield any time I want. I have transmutation magic for it. Dominic suggested. Well, that should do the job. It is better to use natural metals. The impurities in them tend to create a better result than the pure metals from the spells. But you're right. Drawing out the designs is one thing, testing them is another. We can't have an incident like the elemental happening in the forge, or when you give gear to some nobleman as a gift. The old man agreed. Or, that could be the best time for it. It all depends on the nobleman, really. Amy suggested. There is that. But I don't think we're going to be giving something so hard to make to people nobody likes. Chapter 419. Line up the layers. Dominic and the research-obsessed wizard sat across the bench from each other as they double-checked the plans for the Magitech orbs. Those were the first step in the design before they started to make the shield and alter the Magitech circuitry that would let the spell effect flow over the surface and through the user. It all looks fine, but we won't know until we actually make one whether we missed anything or not. The mage finally decided after a few more minutes of final checks. Dominic nodded and took out a sheet of copper, while the old man took out engraving tools for the both of them. Miss Amy, can you make the gems that we need? You have a fine sense for the facets and proportions. The elder requested. Amy smiled and began to channel mana for the gems while the others began carving runes into their copper sheets, which would later bend into the shell of the orbs. The only issue that Dominic could find was that with an orb this advanced, everything had to be done in nearly microscopic detail. Each rune was tiny. The pathways for the circuitry to link the layers were no more than a hair width wide. But when the layers were assembled, it all had to line up perfectly, or nothing would work. The level of precision was even less forgiving than making rifles, where proper fitment of the parts was essential not only for function, but also for accuracy. Still, the more that he worked on it, using the old man's magnifying glass to ensure there were no mistakes with the runes, the more comfortable Dominic got with the work. It was not something that could be rushed or mass-assembled like the rifles. It was the work of a true artisan. And not a short project. The sun had long since set by the time that they had the first of the 3 orbs assembled, and the old man gestured toward a cot in the back of the room. We can sleep here and continue in the morning. But I suggest that we test this orb first so that we know if we can move on, or if we need the night to think on where we went wrong. Dominic laughed at the eager tone, despite the man's knowledge that this experiment might just explode in his face after a whole day of work. Or worse, it might simply fail to do anything at all. The first orb that they had made was the spell amplification orb, as it was the most complex of the 3. Flaming Blade was relatively simple, but needed a precisely cut gem, while the mana collection and orb that would reduce casting cost was between the 2 in difficulty and relied on a higher grade, but small mana gem. Dominic gently poured mana into the orb and smiled as it came to life with a gentle blue glow. Well, step 1 is a success. It activated. Now, to see if it actually works. Not an offensive spell. Amy reminded him. I do know other magic.
Well,
Some other magic. Why don't we test it with an area barrier? Dominic suggested. Area barriers are an option, but not the greatest choice. They're a bit of a pain to get rid of if the orb malfunctions and causes them to cast outside of your control. Especially when the purpose of the orb is to make them stronger than usual. The old researcher noted.
Right.
A super strong barrier in the middle of the lab would be a real pain, especially when it came time to try to safely remove it. Dominic sighed as he thought about his options. He really didn't have a lot of spells, and he didn't want to cast it directly on himself, in case the spell didn't work properly. So he went with the best option that he had left. Clay to steel. The difference in the quality of the metal would be enough to tell him if the orb was working properly, and there was little risk to anyone else if it didn't. Dominic activated the spell through the amplification orb and smiled as the metal began to transform. But then it just kept transforming, turning from shining steel to something faintly blue in color. Oh, that is interesting. The orb worked, in a way, but not properly. Instead of upcasting the level, it increased the quality of the spell's transformation effect. That should be mana steel, the lowest grade of magical steel. Not as good as the dark iron that you got from the Minotaurs, but a magical metal all the same. Now, where did we go wrong? The old mage muttered to himself. Dominic stared intently at the metal for a few minutes as it stabilized, then back at the blueprint. Could this be it? I think that we weren't specific enough in what we wanted, so the effect might not be reliable. Try yours and see what happens,
he suggested.
The second orb activated as planned, and a small clay bowl turned to a rich carbon steel, suitable for the finest of tools. Well, that one works. Or could it be random chance? The old mage pondered. Then, he picked up Dominic's orb and tried it. The effect was the same as his own had been, and then the same again on a third try. Confused, Dominic picked up the orb that the mage had created and cast it again. The metal went from shiny stainless steel to faintly blue mana steel again. I think that the problem is with you. It's not that we weren't specific enough with the orb for most people, it's that your understanding of metal quality is different. Try it with an area barrier this time, now that we know it won't do anything extreme. Amy suggested. Dominic cast the barrier, which looked normal enough to him, but he wasn't an expert in barriers. Amy took out a small box with a dial on it and placed it against a barrier. Level 18 area barrier. It worked exactly as intended. But what level is your base barrier at?
She asked.
Level 13, almost 14 now. The old man nodded, then handed Amy the orb. Test that. Her barrier went up, making Dominic's look frail. Oh, nice. With this, my area barrier passes the level 20 mark, where there's a step up in power. Not bad for a level 0 unattuned orb. That step up in power at level 20 had to be a rather significant one, Dominic realized as he mentally compared the two barriers. Either that, or his was highly lacking for its level. Either one was a possibility, given their backgrounds. The old man shrugged. These orbs don't level up, they are based on the level of the spell being cast, a flat amplification that doesn't attune to the user. You can make one that does, but it's not this one. They were also not nearly as efficient as this one, Dominic knew. Even if you did increase the level, it was more of a passive power buff than an increase in casting level. Chapter 420. Nice. The next morning they started on the mana collection orbs, the second half of the spell buff that would apply no matter what combat spells were eventually put on the shield. Once those were done, they could make shields to mount them in and begin the work of altering the circuitry so that the final product would be one cohesive magic item and not a shield with 3 orbs added to the price. That was the most important part. If they didn't all activate as one, then the lower-level users would gain little to no benefit from the added complexity, and they would have wasted a huge amount of effort making shields for everyone. Fortunately, this one was much easier to make, and Dominic could grow the necessary mana gem in only a few minutes, a rate far faster than either of the 2 mages in the room. Once we finish these, we can do a quick test to verify them, but it's not a new design, so there shouldn't be any issues. The problems will only come when we try to integrate them with the shields. Dominic couldn't fault that logic, and the orb both received and discharged mana without issues. So it was time to actually make the shield that they were going to integrate them into. But that meant they needed the final orbs so that everything could be tested at the same time instead of making multiple items. Why don't I make the orbs, and you can make the shields to put them in? It won't take me long to make orbs that I'm already familiar with, and I will provide you the blueprints so that you can make more of them later. The old mage suggested. That sounds like the most time-efficient method to me. All right, I will make the shields out of steel, and they'll be ready by the time that you finish with the orbs. They're not a simple item, but we only need two. The old man wasn't big on conversation when it didn't directly relate to his work, so the two worked in silence for hours. Relative silence that was great. One whistles while he works, and one talks to himself. Are there no paths to creative genius that lead to sanity? Amy quietly complained as she waited for them. You're doing it now, too. I'm afraid that it's too late for you, but it won't get any quieter when we get home. I've been gone 2 days, and didn't tell my wife where I was going. Dominic joked. Amy rolled her eyes. Don't worry, I sent someone to inform the manor that you were busy with crafting new defensive items for the royal guards, so we won't get yelled at or dragged out by armed paladins before we finish. The old man stroked his beard and nodded appreciatively. This is the value of a good apprentice. They take care of the little details so you don't have to. True, she's not only skilled, but proactively helpful. I don't know why the other sect members seem to be afraid of her, Dominic agreed. Probably because she holds too much of a grudge. It's only safe to be around her if you're her friend. You know I'm right here, don't you? Amy growled.
See?
Very scary. Even Amy couldn't help but laugh a little, but the two men didn't stop their work as they bantered back and forth. The shields are ready in their base form. Do you want to wait to do the upgrades to the plan after you finish the flaming blade orbs, or do you want me to do them now? Dominic asked. I'm almost finished. We can upgrade the shield's pathways in a few minutes. It will be easier to do once we have the 3 orbs test-fitted anyhow. Since they're a permanent addition, there is no need to use a universal connection ring inscription. We can just run the circuits directly to the output. Dominic waited as the final orbs were completed, and then set all 3 in place on a shield before bringing out a fresh copper sheet to cut new circuits from. Oh, don't bother with that. There is an easier way. We can just carve them in wax and then press clay into the grooves. A warm chisel makes the whole process painless, and the wax can be molded to the shape that you need. See, this is the kind of practical experience that I came here for. Amy laughed. The old mage nodded happily. Exactly. You need to ask an old person or a lazy worker how to do things. They'll tell you the best way to get it done. He waved his hand to create wax tablets, and Amy sighed. Don't let him make you think the hand gesture is part of the spell. He's just dramatic. Dominic shrugged. It's fun to use a dramatic flourish to take items from storage as well. Everyone knows how it works, but it's still better to do it with some style. Amy took a long swig from a wineskin she had in her storage item. See, this is what I was talking about. Crafters are all a little odd, and it only grows with practice. But you're holding up production. I want to see how this shield works when you've got everything assembled. Dominic nodded and began drawing the added circuits and runes to the wax. The elder watched as he worked, and then poured a bit of wax into a few runes and redrew them. This should work better. The meaning is a bit more clear, and we don't want any complexity in how the orbs interact. I don't doubt that it would work your way, but it's better to be extra safe so that it won't malfunction if another craftsman needs to repair it. He explained. Dominic hadn't considered that. Normally, everyone brought his rifles back to him for repair. Nobody else even tried to do the work.